One autumn morning in 1881, a strange woman knocked on the door of a forgotten homestead in the Montana Valley. She said just one thing. "I was told, you need a cook." But the widowed cowboy saw something else. Standing behind her was a little girl, with the same eyes as the wife he had lost. How did this woman know his house? Why did the child look so painfully familiar? And if she truly was his daughter, why didn't the mother say so from the start? And now, let the wind and the dust do the talking. The knock struck the cabin door like a warning shot. Hard, sharp, out of place in Levi. Stokes froze mid-swing axe, raised above the chopping block, his breath turning white in the cooling air. He hadn't had a visitor in weeks. Not here. Not after everything. Then a woman's voice came low, but steady, carrying through the woods. "I was told you need help." For a long moment, Levi didn't move. Then through the narrow crack of the door, he caught the glint of brass. An old kerosene lantern, its glass cracked, its handle smoothed from years of holding. His chest tightened. The same kind of lamp he had once pressed into his wife's hands, the spring they built this place together. The same wife he had buried. Hours earlier, Ruth Callahan and her daughter Ellie had climbed the last ridge before the valley opened. The Bitterroot Mountains rose like dark shoulders behind them, the trail falling away in switchbacks and dust. Ruth's boots crunched over brittle grass. One heel split the other, patched with cloth from a grain sack. She carried the lantern in her free hand, gripping it, as though it were the only proof she had of belonging anywhere. Ellie walked beside her, silent as dawn, clutching the strap of her satchel. 7 years old, with eyes too wide and too knowing, she kept one step behind her mother, as though the earth might shift without warning. Ahead, beneath 3 towering pines, stood a cabin, weathered to the color of old bark. Smoke curled weakly from its chimney. Not supper smoke, just enough to say someone lived there. Ruth paused at the porch, her heart pushing against her ribs. She drew one steadying breath, lifted her chin, and knocked. 2 raps, firm and certain. Ellie pressed close, small fingers curling into her mother's coat. The door opened a crack. The man who looked out was taller than she expected, broad shoulders filling the frame, dark hair brushing past his collar, eyes sharpened not by kindness, but by years of sun and silence. His linen shirt hung open at the chest, rough from work, his arms strong and corded. He said nothing. Ruth held his gaze. "I can cook, clean, work with livestock, bees too if need be." But Levi Stokes wasn't looking at her. Not at first. His eyes had fixed on the lantern in her hand, where the last of the sunset caught the cracked glass like fire. "Where'd you get that?" His voice was low, rough, like gravel in the riverbed. Ruth blinked. "It belonged to my mother. She gave it to me the year I married." Something in Levi's jaw shifted, clenched, then eased. He opened the door a little wider. "I had one just like it," he muttered. "Gave it to my wife. She liked the way it caught the wind." The silence that followed weighed heavier than words. "I'm not asking for charity," Ruth said softly. "Only shelter. Just until the frost. I'll earn it. The girl won't be trouble." At that, Levi finally looked past her. His gaze landed on Ellie, small, solemn, clutching her satchel like an anchor. She met his eyes for a heartbeat, then dropped them again. But she didn't hide. Something flickered across his face, not warmth, but not stone either. A memory, maybe. "This ain't a boarding house," he said. "I understand. There's stew left, and a bedroll by the stove. You can stay the night." Ruth nodded once. "Thank you." Inside the cabin was cool, thick-walled, holding the scent of pine pitch, beeswax, and something floral that lingered faintly, as though a woman had once left her presence here. Ruth placed the lantern on the low table. Ellie slipped into a chair, her feet not touching the floor. Levi moved quietly, lighting a stub of candle. Shadows stretched long across the room, plain wood walls, a rifle resting in its place, 3 handmade chairs worn smooth by years. "I'm Ruth," she said. "This is Ellie." He paused, then answered Levi. The name hung between them like another silence. Ruth bent to the stove, coaxing life from a few coals, stirring the pot left from his supper. The scent of stew rose warm. She ladled 2 bowls and set them on the table, not taking his place. After a moment, Levi pushed the 3rd bowl toward her. "You're here now. Might as well eat." Outside, the wind rattled dry grass along the porch. The night pressed close, sharp and cold. But inside that cabin, under the light of a cracked old lantern, 3 lives shared one table for the first time. It wasn't fire yet, but it was kindling. You're watching Wild West Memories, where Wild West stories are not only about cowboys and gunfire, but also about humanity, longing, and untold secrets. If you love the heartfelt spirit of the frontier, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell right now, so you won't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Every day a new story awaits you on the horizon. The next morning came with a silver haze over the trees. Mist clung to the lower pasture, and dew gathered on the porch railings, like caught offerings from the night. Ruth rose early before the rooster's cry, and stepped outside with bare feet and careful hands. The kitchen fire was still glowing warm from embers she'd banked after supper. She cooked without fuss, cornbread with wildflower honey, and a pan of beans left over from the night before. The smells curled through the cabin, like something soft brushing past one's shoulder. She didn't speak much, only moved with the kind of steady rhythm that belonged to someone used to making a little go far. Levi watched from the doorway, one shoulder pressed to the frame, arms folded across his chest. He didn't interfere, didn't offer help or judgment, just stood there quiet, as the land itself, eyes following her, with the same caution he gave to clouds before a storm. By mid-morning, Ruth had found the shed and begun sorting through its clutter. She stacked the clean jars, swept out the old sawdust, and repaired 2 of the cracked hive lids with wax-dipped twine she'd brought from her satchel. She didn't ask where things were. She simply seemed to know. When Levi passed by with a box of kindling, she glanced up only once and said, "You'll need heavier frames by frost." He didn't answer, but later she found the frames leaned outside the door, just as she'd mentioned. Ellie was a world of her own. She found a patch of smooth stone behind the cabin, where the morning sun hit just right. There she knelt with a stick of white chalk from her mother's bag and began to draw. Quietly, diligently. She made shaped circles inside circles, stars with uneven arms, flowers with too many petals. At times she would hum to herself, low and breathy, like a song no one taught her. Other times she would pause and look around, eyes searching the air for something unseen. And when she grew tired, she would climb into the wooden rocking chair by the hearth, the one that hadn't rocked in over 3 years. Levi noticed it the first time after lunch. Ruth had gone outside to hang laundry, and Ellie was inside, curled into the fabric of the old seat, legs tucked beneath her, her thumb in her mouth. The chair rocked slowly, as though remembering its purpose. It creaked a little, just enough to sound like memory. He stopped in the hall and stared. That chair had belonged to his wife, Belle. It had cradled her through sickness, through late evenings, when their baby cried, through days when the cold seeped deep into bone. After she died from the burns, weeks after the fire on the Helena line, he hadn't let anyone touch it. Not even the girl's things. And the girl, well, she was gone. The fire took the last rail car, and they never found a trace. Not a shawl, not a shoe. He stood there too long. Ellie turned and saw him. She didn't speak, didn't shift, just blinked as if she knew this space was borrowed, not stolen. He turned away before she could see the tightness in his jaw. That night, when the sky turned deep violet and coyotes howled far off in the gulch, Ruth sat by the stove cleaning a jar of wild honey. The lantern glowed beside her on the table, casting a warm circle of gold over her hands. She was humming softly, a tune with no words. Levi stood outside on the porch staring at the moon, through the silhouettes of the pines. The air smelled like pine sap and ash. He didn't hear her approach, only noticed when her shadow moved beside his. "I can work through first snow," she said gently, "if you'll allow us to stay till then." He didn't answer right away. His arms were crossed, hands, calloused veins raised under skin browned by work. His chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm, beneath the open collar of his linen shirt. "I don't need help," he said. Ruth didn't flinch. "But maybe the bees do." He gave a short breath, halfway to a chuckle, but never got there. "You fix a lot of things that ain't yours," he said. "I fix what's broken if it stays in my hands long enough." That silenced them both. After a moment, he turned to go back inside. As he did, his eye caught the lantern on the table. Its brass rim glinted in the dark, like something from a long-lost dream. The glass was cracked, yes, but whole. The same shape, the same kind. He'd bought one just like it from a shop in Kansas City. Gave it to Belle the spring they married. She used to keep it lit by the bedside, said she couldn't sleep unless there was light to talk to. He hadn't thought of that in a long while. Now a stranger had brought its twin into his home, without knowing what it meant, without asking what it stirred. Back inside, Ruth had finished packing the honey. Ellie was asleep on a folded quilt by the hearth, arms around her satchel, like it might disappear. The rocking chair stood still, but Levi could almost hear it. Ruth looked up as he entered, but didn't speak. She read something in his silence that didn't require questions. He moved to the cabinet, took down a second blanket, and laid it gently beside Ellie. His hand brushed the top of her head, barely a touch. Then he stepped away, as if he hadn't meant to do it at all. Ruth whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer, but he stood there longer than he needed to, listening to the faint breath of the girl, to the sound of the wind curling against the window panes. The lantern flickered once, then settled. And somewhere in the stillness, a door in him didn't open, but it didn't close either. It wasn't long before Ruth needed to make the journey into town. Supplies were thinning. The flour had weevils in it, and Levi's jar of kerosene was down to the dregs. He gave her a list, short, practical, written in firm strokes on the back of an old invoice, and a few silver coins from a coffee tin that jingled like it hadn't been touched in months. "You'll want the dry goods store on Main," he said, not quite looking at her. "Don't linger. Folks there got more ears than manners." Ruth nodded. She didn't ask why. Shallow Creek was a half-day's walk, or a quarter by wagon. Levi hitched the mare to his buckboard and let her take it alone. Ellie came to curled beside her with a blanket tucked up to her chin, silent as ever when they crossed into unfamiliar ground. The town itself was little more than a spread of storefronts along a dusty artery. A smithy, a church, the marshal's office, 2 saloons competing across the street. But it had people, too many eyes, too much curiosity, packed into so little space. Ruth tied the mare outside the general store and lifted Ellie down. They were barely inside before the whispers began. 2 women near the seed barrel pretended not to glance her way, but their hands paused on the burlap sacks. A boy stocking lamp oil froze in his tracks, staring wide-eyed until the shopkeep barked his name. Somewhere near the back, someone muttered, "That's her. From the ridge. The one with the child." Ruth kept her chin up and moved deliberately through the shelves. Flour, soap, a new spool of thread. Her hands didn't tremble, but Ellie clung tighter to her skirt, wide-eyed and wordless. It was at the counter that she met him. Lang Burroughs, town physician. Long coat, dusty hat, spectacles perched low on a crooked nose. He smelled faintly of wintergreen and bitterness. "Mrs. Callahan," he greeted, her voice like dried leaves. "I see Levi's opened his doors to more than bees these days." Ruth turned polite, but guarded. We're not a burden, just passing through. Passing through with a girl who calls you Mama. Though none can say where she was born or who her father is. Ruth didn't blink. Children don't choose their beginnings. No Lang agreed, but townsfolk choose what to believe. You might find that troublesome here. She placed a silver piece on the counter. Then they can believe I paid fair and left no debts. He stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. Word is, you've got papers from somewhere else. Colorado, maybe. Some say there's a marshal with your name pinned on a wall. Ruth met his eyes evenly. Some say the moon's made of cheese. Lang smirked, adjusting his spectacles. Don't mistake kindness for amnesia, Mrs. Callahan. This town forgets nothing. And Mavis Cray, he tilted his chin toward the street, remembers better than most. She finished packing the sack and took Ellie's hand. As they stepped outside, the sun hit hard. Dust swirled along the boardwalk like ghosts with nowhere left to go. Across the street, Mavis Cray stood beneath the awning of the post office, lips painted, arms crossed. She watched Ruth with the interest of a cat eyeing a bird not yet wounded. Mavis had been the widow of a freighter, a man with a drinking problem, and 3 unpaid debts. Since his death, she'd attached herself to whatever male stood steady enough to shoulder her ambition. Lately that meant Levi Stokes. She crossed the street without invitation. Pretty girl, she said to Ruth, glancing at Ellie, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Doesn't look much like you, though. Ruth said nothing. Course we all understand hardship, Mavis went on. Taken in a stray now and then, claiming her as your own, it tugs the heart really. But some of us just worry, you know, about who's sleeping under Levi's roof. Especially when she's hiding under someone else's name. Ruth's voice when it came was calm. You speak like someone who lost something. Mavis leaned in, her perfume sour in the heat. Just watching what belongs to this town. Levi arrived moments later, striding down the road from the blacksmith's hands, black with grease and shirt open to his chest. His presence cut through the tension like an axe through kindling. He said nothing to Mavis, only looked at Ruth, then Ellie, then the sack in her hand. You done? Yes, Ruth replied quietly. He took the sack from her shoulder, then placed a hand firm protective on Ellie's back. Mavis scoffed, but didn't linger. She turned with a flick of her skirt and crossed back toward the saloon. On the way home, the wagon creaked gently over the dirt road. Ruth sat close but silent. Ellie dozed against her side, the morning's tension finally worn out of her little frame. Levi said nothing for a long time. But as the pines thickened and the homestead came into view, he glanced over at Ruth. You get what you needed. She hesitated. Yes. Good. You get what you didn't too. She turned to him, then studying his face in profile. The strong line of his jaw, the dust on his cheekbone, the way his hand rested easy on the reins though his eyes said otherwise. You believe what they say? She asked softly. He kept his eyes forward. I don't listen much to folks who don't do the work. That night, Ruth placed the new spool of thread in a drawer beside the hearth. Ellie colored quietly, with a dull pencil on brown paper. Levi stood outside in the yard, his silhouette framed by starlight. And in that house built of silence and guarded hearts, something shifted, subtle as the first breeze before the storm. Not loud, not final, but present. A man who saw and did not judge. A woman who stood and did not flinch. And a child who for once clung not from fear, but from the recognition of being held. The mornings grew quieter as summer folded into early autumn. The air turned crisp, and the scent of pine needles mingled with ripe apples left to dry on the porch rail. Levi spent most days tending to the hives, speaking little, watching much. Ruth, too, had found a rhythm. She rose early, made bread, tended the kitchen, and taught Ellie to sound out her letters under the kitchen window. But it was on one of her solitary walks, following the slope behind the apiary, that Ruth stumbled upon something Levi had never mentioned: the wild honey creek. It was tucked into a fold of earth just past the old split-rail fence, a stream no wider than a man's stride running slow and golden beneath a canopy of bee trees. Their branches hung heavy with wild combs, bees humming in and out like the pulse of a quiet heart. The place felt sacred, untouched. She knelt, brushing her fingers along a fallen twig, slick with resin. The ground smelled of moss and sweetness. Later, when she asked Levi why he'd never shown her, he only said, wasn't ready to look at it again. That night, Ruth sat alone by the hearth after Ellie had gone to bed. The shadows stretched long against the walls. She'd been wiping the frame of an old wedding portrait, Levi and a dark-haired woman, with kind, knowing eyes, when the edge of her cloth caught a sliver of paper tucked behind the wood. It fell into her lap. A letter, creased but clean, the ink faded yet strong. Levi, if this finds you after I'm gone, know that I loved you more than breath. And if our little girl survived, if by God's hand she's somewhere alive, then please forgive yourself. Don't spend your life buried in pain. Grieve me, but let her laugh again. Ruth sat frozen. The lamp flickered. She read it again and again. A breath caught in her chest. Ellie. She hadn't known, not fully. But now memories rushed back with a strange, terrible clarity. 2 years ago in Colorado Territory, a convoy of wagons had been ambushed by outlaws posing as cavalry. Ruth, then on her way west with a group of displaced settlers, had heard the shots in the night. She'd run toward the fire, found wreckage and bodies, and beneath a canvas flap, crying half-burnt, a ragged doll clutched to her chest, a child. She hadn't known her name. The girl couldn't speak for weeks. There had been a scar faint like a crescent moon just behind the girl's right ear. Ruth had always thought it odd how the child winced when touched there. Belle's letter hadn't described it, but Ruth remembered Levi mentioning once in passing how his daughter had fallen as a baby and split the skin behind her ear. A scar. Her hands trembled. She looked to the hallway where Ellie slept, curled under a patchwork quilt. Her breath was steady, lips parted just slightly in sleep. Ruth wanted to cry out, to tell someone, to run to Levi and place Ellie into his arms, to say, here is what you thought lost, here is your daughter. But she didn't. Instead, she sat. Hours passed, the fire dimmed. Because there was another truth she couldn't ignore. She loved that child. Not as a caretaker, not as a guardian, as a mother. She had soothed her fevers, braided her hair, sung to her on nights when screams still woke her. She had built a life from nothing, a fragile, trembling life, and to give Ellie away, now even to the man who had once cradled her as an infant, felt like a tearing too deep to survive. Ruth pressed the letter to her chest. What would Levi do if he knew? Would he take the child without question? Would he turn from Ruth, angry for the silence, for the stolen time? And what of Ellie? A girl who barely remembered her own name. When Ruth found her, would she even understand what it meant to belong to someone new? There was no easy choice. Only the silence of the hearth, the weight of memory, and the unbearable tenderness of knowing something that could shatter everything. Later, she placed the letter back behind the frame. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because for now, the truth was too heavy to hand away. She stood across the room and knelt beside Ellie's bed. Gently she touched the child's curls, smoothing them away from her forehead. I love you, she whispered, too soft for even the night to echo. And in that moment, as the wind rustled the eaves and the beasts slept in their trees, Ruth Callahan held her secret close, a truth written in blood and wax and silence, and a love that refused to let go. The first frost had come early to the Bitter Root Valley. The mornings held the crispness of coming winter, and the bees moved slower now, their golden work nearly done for the season. 3 Pines Homestead stood quiet beneath a sky the color of tin. But peace is a fragile thing. Mavis Cray, widow of the grain merchant, and a woman with a voice like vinegar, filed a petition with the local magistrate. She claimed Ruth was squatting illegally and raising a child who wasn't her own. Lang Burroughs, whose medical license came from a town no longer on most maps, joined in citing moral irregularities and unfit maternal history. Word traveled faster than wind. One morning, Ruth stood in the kitchen with a sack half-packed, hands trembling over folded linens. She'd seen the stares in town, heard whispers twist into something poisonous. She knew what came next. Levi entered quietly, wiping frost from his sleeves. He watched her a moment, the set of her shoulders, the heaviness in her breath. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "I can't stay and bring ruin to what you've built," she whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he crossed to the old mantel, the one where Belle's wedding portrait hung. He meant to clean the frame, a reflex more than intention, but his hand knocked it loose. The photo hit the floor with a soft thud, and from behind the frame something slid free. The letter. It landed face up. Levi paused, the air thick as syrup. He picked it up slowly, read it once, then again. His breath caught somewhere between the lines. "If our little girl survived, if, by God's hand, she's somewhere alive, then please forgive yourself." He looked toward the bedroom, where Ellie's laughter had echoed just that morning. Her scar, her eyes, the way she hummed a tune only Belle used to sing. He didn't speak. He folded the letter with hands that shook more than they should have, slid it back behind the frame, and returned it to the mantel. In the barn that afternoon, he found Ellie sketching with chalk on a piece of old pine. She smiled up at him, missing a front tooth, her cheeks flushed. "I made you something," she said, holding it out. A drawing, crude but tender, showed 3 figures under a hanging honeycomb. A tall man, a woman with long hair, and a little girl with wings. Levi looked at it a long while. Then he knelt and without a word took Ellie into his arms. She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. That night, he rode into town with one purpose. The magistrate's office was dim, a single lantern burning low. Papers rustled as he laid them down. Ruth's documents, letters from neighbors, even receipts for bee supplies she'd ordered. "I want to file guardianship," he said. The clerk looked up. "Under what provision?" Levi's voice was steady. "Act of Providence." It was a rarely used clause, born of frontier necessity, granting custody when law and blood faltered, but providence and stability prevailed. When Levi returned that night, he found Ruth on the porch, her coat bundled, her bag by her feet. She didn't look at him. "It's better if I go." He walked up slowly, then said, voice low, "You saved what I lost." He looked to Ellie's window, the lamplight still flickering inside. "I won't lose it again." Ruth's breath caught. She turned to him, her eyes glassy. "You don't understand." "I do," he said. He didn't say more, didn't need to. The next morning, frost clung to the fields like lace. Ellie ran to the fence line to check on the bees, her drawing still clutched in one hand. And Levi watched her, knowing more than he'd dared hope. But for now, he would wait for the right time. Because sometimes the truest love was the quiet kind, the kind that held space, gave breath, and never asked for more than what the heart could offer freely. The early wind swept through the Bitterroot Valley that morning, sharp as a blade. It cut into the silence like a warning. The bees flew low and slow over the season's last blossoms, and the half-bare trees whispered of endings. Ruth was by the stove stirring cornbread batter when hoofbeats shattered the quiet. Not the gentle trot of a neighbor, but urgent, resolute. Ellie looked up from her drawing. "Mama?" Ruth didn't answer. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart pounding louder than thought. A black-topped wagon appeared beyond the pines. A man on horseback followed and dismounted, long coat shoulders, heavy with years but eyes still razor-sharp, just as they had been the last time Ruth saw him. "Elias Callahan," she whispered. Her father. He approached with a Bible tucked under one arm and a folded paper in the other. Levi stepped out from the apiary, frowning at the stranger. "What do you want here?" Levi asked, standing between Ruth and the man. Elias didn't glance at him, his eyes fixed on Ruth. "I've come to take the child." Ellie immediately hid behind Ruth's skirt, clutching the fabric tight. "You have no right here," Ruth said, her voice wavering. Elias held out the paper. "A judge's order. You're not kin. You have no legal claim to the girl." Levi stepped forward, but Ruth raised a hand to stop him. Her breath quickened. "You cast me out when I needed grace," she said, her voice rising. "When I held Ellie in my arms, no name, no home, you turned away. And now you come to steal what I built with pain." Elias's jaw clenched. "You live in sin. I gave you a chance to repent. You gave me silence." The wind picked up dry leaves skittering across the porch. Ellie clung tighter. Ruth stood pale, but her eyes blazed. Levi stood nearby, silent, but his fist had curled at his side. Ruth turned to him, her voice cracking, no longer hiding. "Ellie is your daughter." The world seemed to go still. "After the wagon raid, I found her, burned memoryless. But she lived. I didn't know who she was, only that she needed someone. Then I saw the scar behind her ear, heard her hum Belle's lullaby." Levi said nothing. Not right away. At last he spoke softly. "I knew. I was just waiting for you to say it with your heart, not your fear." Ruth's knees gave out. She sank to the porch, covering her face. Ellie watched, bewildered, sensing the storm had passed. Levi turned to Elias, his gaze like iron. "Your order means nothing. That child is mine by blood, by heart, and by providence." Elias scoffed. "You have no proof." Levi pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket. He opened it slowly. "Belle wrote this before she passed, in her own hand. She believed our daughter might still live. This is her voice, and it speaks louder than your decree." He handed the letter to Elias. The old man read a few lines, then stopped. His eyes teared. "Just enough." Levi stepped forward. "You won't take her. Not now. Not ever." Elias stood unmoving, wind tugging at his coat like it passed through stone. Then, wordless, he turned and climbed into the wagon, driving away from the apiary. The wheels creaked off into the trees and were gone. Days later, the town began to shift. Word spread about Ruth's loyalty, Levi's truth, the secrets laid bare. Mrs. Hargraves from the school sent over children's books. The grocer opened a winter account for Ruth. Even Mavis Cray brought over an apple pie, mumbling something no one caught. That Sunday the preacher read a verse from Psalms, then added one of his own. "Some families are born from blood. Some are carved from kindness." Ruth sat beside Levi. Ellie nestled between, her small hand resting on both of theirs. The ghosts of the past did not vanish, but light, slow and curtain was finding its way back. The last frost of autumn had melted from the barn roof, leaving thin rivulets of water, tracing paths down the shingles. Three Pines homestead stood quiet, but not still. Within its modest walls, something unseen had begun to grow like honey, thickening in the comb, slow but sure. After Elias Callahan's retreat, Ruth barely slept. For days, she kept herself busy stacking firewood, mending the clothesline, organizing canning jars that didn't need organizing. Anything to keep her mind from spiraling. Levi, meanwhile, worked in silence, but not distance. One afternoon, while Ellie napped in the rocker, Ruth stepped onto the porch where Levi was sanding a small bench. Not just any bench, a child-sized desk made of pine, with a little drawer carved beneath the writing surface. She watched his hands strong, deliberate, as they moved over the grain. "You're making that for her," she said. He didn't look up. "She deserves a space to learn and draw." "You saw the way she lit up when she got those books from town." Ruth stepped closer. "You're good with your hands." "Hands can't fix everything," he muttered. A pause. Ruth sat down on the step beside them, her voice small but steady. "Back when we first arrived, I told you my husband had died." "That wasn't true." Levi looked up now but didn't interrupt. "I said it because people ask fewer questions of a widow. Less judgment. No one tries to take what they think isn't rightfully yours." "You were protecting her," Levi said. Ruth nodded. "I didn't know who Ellie really was. Not then. All I knew was she needed shelter, and I needed purpose. Maybe I made myself a story to keep both." Levi wiped his hands on a cloth, the rough linen brushing over calloused fingers. "You didn't lie to me. You survived. Sometimes that means choosing the words the world can live with." Inside, Ellie stirred and yawned. She padded to the door, rubbing her eyes. "Is it done?" she asked, pointing at the desk. "Almost," Levi said, smiling softly. "Needs one last drawer pull." Ellie ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Thank you." That evening, as dusk painted the hills in lavender and gold, townsfolk began to appear at the edge of the property, some carrying lanterns, others holding baskets, tools, even folded quilts. Joseph Elliott stood at the front, papers in hand. "It's official," he said. "Guardianship recognized by the Territory Office. On all counts." Mavis Cray, once sharp-tongued, hung back by the fence. She didn't speak, but her lowered gaze and half-step forward said enough. Lang Burrows offered a nod, perhaps not apology, but acknowledgement. Then came the quiet ceremony. One by one, lanterns were hung along the wooden posts surrounding the homestead. Soft amber light glowed against the darkening sky. "Every home deserves light," the blacksmith's wife said. "Yours has 3. Later that night, when the house had gone quiet and the lanterns outside swayed in the wind, Levi found Ellie sitting alone by the hive shed, hugging her little sketchbook. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Ellie shook her head. "My tummy feels fluttery. Like the bees." He knelt beside her. "That happens when something big changes, even something good." She looked up at him, then reached into her sketchbook and tore out a page. A new drawing. A man, a woman, and a child beneath a tree, heavy with honeymoon. She placed it in his hands. "Mama says family isn't just about names. But if I could pick a name, I'd like yours." Levi's eyes stung, voice rough. "You already have it, little one." Then he opened his arms, and Ellie leaned in, not out of politeness, but because something old in her bones recognized the safety there. That night, the father who thought he'd lost everything held his daughter close. Not lost, not gone, found. Later, Ruth stood by the window as Ellie read aloud from a primer by the desk Levi built. Her voice was careful, proud. Levi leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching them both. Ruth turned to him. "You didn't promise us safety," she said. "No," Levi replied. "But I meant every board, every word." She stepped close, placed a hand gently over his heart. "You gave us more than a home. You gave us space to breathe." He touched her hand, then brought it to his lips. No vows were spoken. None were needed. Outside, the lanterns flickered in the breeze, casting long shadows across the field. The honeybees slept in their hives. The stars blinked awake overhead. And in the soft hush of evening, beneath the halo of a worn oil lamp, Three Pines Homestead glowed, not with perfection, but with peace. Not just a shelter, a family. The light had returned. "I reckon that's all the dust we'll kick up tonight, friend." I'll be riding off now, but if you're still by the fire next time, I'll bring another tale. From the West, where silence speaks loudest,